welcome to the Westminster Institute. I'm Robert Riley, its director. Today we're very pleased to welcome back David Goldman, who is a Renaissance man, a music theoretician, an economist, a first-class political thinker, and an author who's familiar to many from his years of writing articles under the pseudonym Spengler. Who the Spengler was or is was a great mystery to all of us who avidly read those articles and were so impressed by the insights that he provided in crucial foreign policy issues. David finally revealed that he was Spengler, and he continues to write those illuminating columns. He is a fellow at the Claremont Institute's Center for the American Way of Life. He is on the board of advisors of the Sino-Israel Government Network and Academic Leadership, and he is a fellow at the Corvinus Institute for Advanced Studies in Budapest, where he currently is doing work on and research on Hungarian capital markets and entrepreneurship. According to the Claremont Review of Books, by the way, the Spengler columns in the Asia Times have attracted readership in the millions. His analyses of global events have become very highly regarded. Former CIA National Intelligence Council Vice Chairman Herbert Myers said, "Ask anyone in the intelligence business to name the world's most brilliant intelligence service, and he will all give the same answer, Spengler," or better known now as David Goldman. David has appeared on many programs and many different journals, and he's the author of a number of books, including, most recently, You Will Be Assimilated, China's Plan to Sinoform the World. Also, How Civilizations Die and Why Islam is Dying Too. And it's not the end of the world, it's just the end of you, the extinction of nations. David, welcome back. Let's go straight to your very controversial article, How the War Party Lost. Who is the War Party and what have they lost?
Bob, well, first, thank you for that extremely kind and generous introduction. The War Party is the uniparty foreign policy establishment and their hangers-on in London and Brussels. And this includes the old George W. Bush and Mitt Romney, John McCain wings of the Republican Party, as much as it does the global liberals of the Democratic Party, including Victoria Nuland, who at the time that the war broke out was Undersecretary of State, and Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, and the whole of the Biden team. As in many things, many grotesque blunders that we as a nation have made in foreign policy in the past 30 years, the magnitude of the blunder was in direct proportion to the consensus that formed around committing that blunder. So in the beginning of 2022, when we stood on the brink of the Ukraine war, there was really a universal consensus among the mandarins of our foreign policy establishment that this war would lead to economic disaster for Russia, military defeat, to the removal of Vladimir Putin from office, and possibly even regime change in Moscow, new kind of political system. That was certainly the hope. Uh, and it's a hope that our interventionist politicians, sometimes labeled neoconservative, have had in mind for more than 20 years, since the 2004 Orange Revolution in Ukraine. Uh, it has been an obsession of our foreign policy establishment to bring democracy to Russia. Victoria Nuland, who in many respects was the architect of this policy with respect to Ukraine and Russia, testified before Congress 10 years ago and bragged that we had spent $20 billion promoting democracy in Russia. That's a whole lot of subsidies to non-governmental organizations, foundations, journalists, and so forth. It's part of the uh, apparatus of USAID and other interventionist subsidies that President Trump has, I think, quite properly begun to shut down. So that is the war party, and that's what the war party believed. And I think the evidence is overwhelming that the war party knew with a very high degree of certainty that the policy that they were pursuing would provoke Russia into an attack on Ukraine. And it was their hope that that attack would be a failure and lead to the consequences I described. So that's the short version.
David, it was always extremely interesting for me to see how many people thought that the invitation to Ukraine into NATO was a move that should be of no concern to Russia in terms of their security. I wondered how they could possibly think such a thing, and the answer would always be, well, but NATO is a very pacific and only defensive organization, so it can't represent a threat to anybody unless it's attacked. And so it's purely defensive. Russia should not have a problem with this.
And
Well, the same way we shouldn't have had a problem with Russia putting missiles into Cuba in 1962.
Exactly.
We
So
nearly went to war for that.
it's just stunning that that point of view could have been so widely shared in foreign policy circles.
There was also an alternative point of view, which was expressed very clearly by people like late Henry Kissinger, by William Burns, who 15 years ago was ambassador to Moscow and, of course, was CIA director under President Biden, that if we did bring Ukraine into NATO, this would be a casus belli for Russia. It would lead to a crisis. And at the time, they strongly counseled against it. And to stick for a moment with the Cuban Missile Crisis analogy, there's an obvious reason why it was intolerable for the United States to accept Russian missiles in Cuba, because the flight time for missiles from Cuba was a few minutes as opposed to 18 or 20 minutes for missiles launched from Moscow. And that's definitely an advantage in nuclear warfighting. By the same token, if you go back to the 10,000-word speech that Putin gave to Russia on the eve of the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, he said specifically, if you have NATO missiles stationed on the Ukrainian-Russian border, they're a few hundred kilometers from Moscow. The anti-aircraft or anti-missile interceptors, which NATO already has in Eastern Europe, can easily be converted into offensive weapons. If you have short-range missiles, they fly in a flat trajectory, so they don't go up high enough to be shot down by existing anti-missile systems. It does create a definite advantage to the NATO side in nuclear war, and the Russians found that intolerable. I think that's one important dimension of the problem, which, having been through the Cuban Missile Crisis ourselves, we should have understood. And indeed, President Trump has said on several occasions that the proposal to bring Ukraine into NATO was what pushed Russia into the war. It was a provocation. By the way, I'm not defending Russia's action. I don't think Russia should have invaded. I think it was a wrong thing to do, but it was not an unprovoked thing to do.
Certainly, Putin could not have warned against it more frequently and made it explicitly clear that inviting Ukraine into NATO was a red line for Russia. So, as you say, the Russian reaction may not be justified, but it certainly should have been anticipated.
Yes, and it
So,
was in fact anticipated by Kissinger, William Burns, and any number of other people. So to plead ignorance in this case runs against the public record of prominent foreign policy figures on both sides of the aisle who warned about that explicitly. That's one dimension. And the other dimension, funnily enough, is demographic. Now, as you know, I'm deeply interested in demographics. I've written books about it. So I'm talking my own obsession here. But if you look at how Russia became Russia, its expanding population settled all through Eastern Europe and all through the Caucasus, all through Siberia. It was an expansionary movement. Russia's own version of manifest destiny was the conquest of the space, which is now the Russian Federation. That was during a period of rapid population expansion. We are used to looking at wars arising from competition for scarce resources by growing populations. The Serbian population was one of the fastest growing populations in the world. In 1914, they wanted the territory of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Hitler wanted Lebensraum. The opposite is the case today. Russia currently has an adult population of 88 million. According to this core UN projection, that will fall to only 48 million by the end of the century. There's no case on record of a country with a rapidly shrinking population going to war for Lebensraum. So the idea that Russia wants to conquer all of Ukraine and then perhaps conquer Poland and Germany and other countries, the Putin is Hitler argument, simply doesn't add up in terms of the basic numbers. The thing that Putin is most short of is Russians. There are 8 billion Russians in Ukraine. He wants them. For the same reason, he was willing to go to war in Georgia for a much smaller number of Russians. He wants to establish the principle that Mother Russia will protect populations of Russians who used to be part of the Soviet Union, but ended up outside the borders of the Russian Federation and the so-called near abroad with a breakup of the USSR 35 years ago. So there is a parallel thing, I think, on the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainian government is not without guilt in provoking this war. It's not simply their desire to get into NATO, it's their refusal to accept language rights for Russians in Ukraine. If you recall, there was an agreement called Minsk II, which everyone sort of penciled in, but was never implemented. And the essence of Minsk II, which I think was originally proposed by the Russians, was Ukraine is neutral. The Russian speakers in Ukraine will have autonomy in a neutral Ukraine, and its borders will be recognized by Russia. The Ukrainian nationalists have done their best to suppress the Russian language, even to the point of suppressing the study of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and other great Russian writers. there may be some great Ukrainian writers, but by some conspiracy of anti-Ukrainian, black arts or something, we just haven't heard of them. So the Ukrainians are also in a demographic death spot. They have one of the lowest birth rates in the world. The Ukrainian language, which is a fragile entity at best, it's the first Ukrainian dictionary was printed in 1918. It used to be considered simply a dialect of Russian or Little Russian. The Ukrainian nationalists who have their reasons to dislike Russia, the starvation of the 1930s and other instances of oppression from Russia historically, went over the top in suppressing Russian culture and the language rights of the Russian population. So there's an element of, I would say, cultural despair on the part of the Ukrainian side, which also provoked the Russians. This is a tragic and terrible and stupid war by two countries with shrinking populations. They should be finding ways to get their young men to have babies as opposed to slaughter each other. It's tragic, stupid, and useless, but not entirely irrational.
So, David, 3 years in, we're now having discussions about ceasefire. That is, the United States is having those discussions with whomever will participate in such talk. Yet, both on the Russian side and on the Ukrainian side, they continue to iterate the fundamental principles or items that are non-negotiable, and those simply have not changed. The other day, Mr. Zelensky said, speaking to journalists, Ukraine would not recognize occupied territory as Russian under any circumstances. Kyiv will never formally accept Russian sovereignty over occupied Ukrainian territory, agree to neutral status, or agree to reduce the size of its armed forces. And if there is any agreement, they must obtain security guarantees. Well, I mean, one doesn't blame President Zelensky for making those demands. On the other hand, those are precisely the demands that Russia absolutely rejects. So President Trump has been the moving spirit behind negotiations that have brought about this partial ceasefire. What do you think of the attempt? I mean, to me, it sounds like neither side is ready to stop fighting.
I think you're right. I applaud President Trump's attempts to make peace. I think he's doing exactly the right thing. However, without the desire of the warring parties to actually have peace, there's only so much that even a very powerful outside mediator can do. It's a tragic pattern in war that the largest number of casualties frequently are suffered after the hope of victory has disappeared. Certainly true in World War II, when the vast majority of German casualties came after Stalingrad and Kursk, when it was clear that Germany was beaten, after Normandy, in fact. It was true in the American Civil War, where the Confederacy fought on for 2 years after Gettysburg and Vicksburg, which turned the tide of the war. Unfortunately, sadly, wars often stop only when all of those who are willing to fight to the death have had the opportunity to do so. And from the standpoint of Zelensky and the hardcore of Ukrainian nationalists, after hundreds of thousands of deaths and a correspondingly large number of wounded, the destruction of very large amounts of infrastructure and the displacement of perhaps 15 million people. Um, the country was really turned inside out, possibly ruined permanently. To accept a humiliating peace, uh, which gives the Russians pretty much whatever they wanted, is unacceptable. A lot of people would rather die than accept such a peace. So sadly, they may have to be given the opportunity to do so. Now, from the standpoint of the Russians, they have the military advantage. They're gaining territory steadily. They're reducing the Ukrainian army. They made pretty short work of the Ukrainian incursion into the Kursk region of Russia, which was supposed to be their great bargaining chip to trade away against other territory. And they have no great motivation to stop. They have some motivation to stop. Russians, for centuries, have stolidly and obediently gone to war when they were told to and fought very bravely. Zelensky and Victoria Nuland and Joe Biden join a long line of people who thought they would fight the Russians successfully and were sorry that they tried, from Charles XII of Sweden during the Great Northern War to Napoleon to Hitler and so forth. The Russians have an advantage. They have good reason to want to stop the war, given the population's weariness with it. On the other hand, from the Russian standpoint, they see Europe talking about rearmament. They see that the war party is still, if not in power in the United States, quite active, and they don't know when a revived Ukraine might be rearmed and restart a war with them. So without a clear idea of what the post-war situation will look like, and without assurances that you will not have a NATO force on their border in Russia in the guise of peacekeepers, I think it's unlikely that Russia will, at this point, agree to end the war. Hell, remember, it took, more than 2 years after negotiations began to end the Korean War. Many people have drawn the analogy between Ukraine and Korea. Syngman Rhee, the president of South Korea, wanted to keep going until all the communists were expelled from both Koreas, from the North. And at some point, Eisenhower simply ignored him and negotiated directly with the communists. And the result is the armistice, which we still have, no peace, but no war. So I think it will be difficult and it will take time to get peace. But I think with President Trump's initiative and the carrots and sticks he can offer to Putin, we will eventually get a peace. And that will be greatly to be celebrated when it happens.
By the way, David, in a recent press conference with Alexander Stubb, the Finnish leader, Zelensky said, and I quote him here, "We will definitely win this war." So, and as you point out, Russia is winning this war slowly, but it seems surely. I would like you to comment on what seems to me perhaps the largest issue that has recently arisen. And it's this. As you well know, throughout the Cold War, the objective of the Soviet Union principally was the separation of the United States from Western Europe. They never achieved that, and thus victory came in the Cold War for the West. Russia, of course, was interested in the same objective after the fall of the Soviet Union. They seem to have achieved it now. The irony is that it's precisely the Europeans are rearming because they no longer have the assurance of the United States that we would respect Article 5 and come to their defense if they're attacked.
To put this in perspective, in 1988, the Bundeswehr, the German army, had 12 battle-ready divisions and thousands of top-of-the-line battle tanks. By some estimates, they were one of the best armies in the world. Helmut Schmidt and later Helmut Kohl spent 15 years building up German defenses, and they had, universal military service, and they were ready to fight. The Bundeswehr today doesn't have a single battle-ready division. It's having difficulty putting together a single battalion, which is supposed to be deployed in the Baltic states as a buffer against possible Russian incursion. It can't find soldiers to volunteer. It has nothing of an officer corps. The French might have 5 battalions. The English army has combat-ready soldiers 18,300, according to their own official estimates, which is not even 2 divisions. So as opposed to the Cold War, when the Europeans, particularly the Germans, certainly the French, had real armies that were well armed and ready to fight, the Europeans have spent the last 30 years living off the peace dividend, completely uninterested in their own defense. And if you look at any of the polls in the major Western European countries where people are asked, are you willing to actually pick up a weapon and defend your country if it's under attack, you get responses in the range of 15 to 25% in most countries. The Scandinavians are a bit higher. The Balts are a bit higher. Turkey is a lot higher. But the major European centers of population and industry just are not interested in defending themselves. So I think in that respect, President Trump is exactly right to say, if you're not going to defend yourselves, why should we pour American blood and treasure into defending you? There are 30 European members of NATO. Collectively, they have nearly 600 million people. That's roughly 4 times Russia's population of, I think, 143 million. In US dollar terms, they have a GDP of $22 trillion, and Russia's GDP is 2.3 trillion. So a GDP in dollar terms, 10 times as big as Russia's. You can argue that maybe Russia's really a little bigger because the currency is artificially depressed, but still, in terms of people and industry, they overpower Russia massively. If they simply dedicated themselves to their own defense, as they did during the Cold War, there would be no question of Russia having any ability to attack them. And now they're coming from zero. They've got no military industry to speak of. They have a population that's deeply opposed, in many cases, to military service. But they haven't been asked, and if they were asked, it might be different. For example, the Conservative Party in Germany, the Alternative für Deutschland, or AfD, proposes a return to conscription. I think it's a good thing. They don't think the army should be separated from society. It should be a people's army, like the Swiss army or the Israeli army. And that was in their election platform. They just took more than 20% of the vote. People call the AfD extreme right. They're not. They're really the old Helmut Kohl wing of the Christian Democrats that split off because the Christian Democrats under Angela Merkel and Friedrich Merz went to the left, to the alliance with the Greens. So I think if you had political leaders in Europe who said, we're going to have to take our own defense seriously and do what we've done in the past, you might move the European populations to think about it differently. The problem is their leadership has been cowardly and short-sighted in making those demands on it.
David, would you say that the demographic decline in Europe is a manifestation of a kind of cultural despair?
Yes, I would say it. I've used that kind of language many times in the past. If there's no new generation to follow us and keep our culture and our songs and stories and religion and history alive, why would you sacrifice your life for a future generation that isn't going to be there? So I think that's absolutely the case. The decline of Western culture, particularly the decline of religion in the West, is the great cause of our demographic decline. It's been pointed out by many people. I published some of those numbers in my book on how civilizations die. Europeans and Americans and Israelis aren't much different. Israelis have a fertility rate of 3.0, 3 children per female lifetime. Europeans 1.5. America 15 years ago was over 2. It's now around 1.6, 1.7. The difference is that Israel has a lot more religious people. America has more religious people than Europe. Religious people in Europe have the same childbearing habits that they do in Israel or the United States. And this is a point which has been made, I think, brilliantly and passionately by Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, that Europe's cultural heritage and its Christian roots are essential to its survival. So Orban has done his best to reverse what appeared to be a catastrophic demographic decline of Hungary 15 years ago when he came into office, both by cultural exhortation and by very strong family subsidies. And that's, I think, a model of what other European countries should attempt. That's why I'd like to see parties like the AfD in power in Germany.
Has Orban succeeded in staunching the demographic decline in Hungary?
Well, the Magyar ethnic Hungarian fertility rate in 2010 was well under 1. Looks like South Korea today. The informal estimate that they came up with internally was 0.83. That's a death sentence. They've now doubled that. It's now 1.6. And the best news is that the marriage rate is very high. And that portends an improvement in childbearing in the future because typically people first get married, then have children. So if you have 3 children in Hungary, you pay no taxes. If you have 1 child, you pay reduced taxes. And there are subsidies for young families to buy apartments and get childcare and so forth. I believe roughly 10% of Hungary's budget is devoted to family support, which, to my knowledge, is the highest proportion in the world. And he's been fighting against a very long-term trend and succeeded in reversing it to a great extent, although they've got a lot more wood to chop.
You have been one of the most eloquent writers and speakers on the subject of the relationship between religion and demography. And you just mentioned again in respect to Israel and the number of religious people in that country. I've certainly observed in the United States that the more conservative Christians, this is particularly true of Catholics, go against the cultural trends, number one, by marrying in the first place, and second of all, by having quite a number of children.
Yes, Ukraine, with its extremely low fertility rate, was before the war a disappearing country. The official population count of Ukraine when it broke off from the USSR in 1992 was 52 million people. Its population now might be half that. Before the war, the Kiev Academy of Sciences estimated that there were only 34 million people resident in Ukraine. There was a larger Ukrainian population, but so many people had emigrated to work that only 33 million people lived there. And with the war, General Keith Kellogg, of course, is part of Trump's team, estimated in a published document that perhaps only 25 million people now live in Ukraine. So the country was already reduced by half. I think many of the Ukrainians who went to the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and other countries will not come back. Germany has a perpetual labor shortage given its extremely low native birth rate. And the German fertility rate is 1.5, 1.6, but among German-born women, it's only 1.3. So the Ukrainians, who are culturally a lot closer to the Germans than, say, Syrians or Afghans coming in, are most welcome, and they're not going to go home. So Ukraine, as I said earlier, fell victim to cultural despair. If you're a Ukrainian nationalist and you simmer with rancor against Russian oppression, which was a real thing historically, the Ukrainians did suffer terribly at the hands of Stalin, and they weren't treated too nicely by the czars either. If you bitterly want to assert your national identity against Russia, then you look at what's happening to your country and you think, this is our last chance. It's do or die. If we don't fight for it now, we'll never have another chance in the future. So it's worth every risk because our culture is going to disappear and there won't be such a thing as Ukraine. That's where you get this kind of, I'd rather die on my feet than live on my knees kind of fanaticism. And also, as I said before, the kind of fanaticism that made it very difficult to achieve a compromise with the Russian part of the population and respect minority language rights, which was a core demand of Putin. And that was a legitimate demand. Certainly, if there were large numbers of Americans living in an adjacent country, say Mexico, and they wanted to have English language schools, we'd consider that a matter of state, a matter of national interest for the United States.
It's interesting how Solzhenitsyn commented on the Ukrainian situation, which he did a number of times. He reflected that in the Soviet Gulag, he got to know a number of Ukrainians, and he himself was almost half Ukrainian, was deeply impressed by the level of bitterness and enmity that the Ukrainians felt toward the Russians for the very reasons that you just mentioned. What Solzhenitsyn suggested, he said, because of all the intermarriage, and it's very difficult to draw any kind of strict borders if you're going to do it according to nationality. What you must do within Russia as well as Ukraine is allow semi-autonomy for those minority cultural groups. Let the Ukrainians in Russia rule themselves, and likewise, as you said earlier, let the Russians in Ukraine rule themselves. I guess no one was listening, even though Solzhenitsyn was perhaps the most distinguished writer and considered a prophet of his time.
Well, if we dial back 35 years to the collapse of communism, our sense of invincibility and our arrogance was at an absolute peak. We were sure that we discovered the magic formula for how to run a successful society, and all we had to do was take that formula and teach it to the great unwashed outside the United States and get them to follow the formula, and the whole world would become liberal democracies, and that would be the end of history. And we all thought that. We didn't expect to win the Cold War the way we did when communism collapsed. We were ecstatic. And the difference between realists and neoconservatives is that realists, over the last 35 years, after having getting their teeth kicked in Iraq, Afghanistan, and various other places, finally came to the conclusion that maybe we should not be going around the world trying to make everyone into little Americas, whereas the hardcore ideologues, the neoconservatives, the global liberals, you can put whatever label you want on them, the American idolaters, if you will, the people who believe that we have the magic formula, we simply have to export it, were still obsessed with this up to and including February of 2022, when this tragic and unnecessary war began. The only good thing about this war is that it really is a catastrophic humiliation for the war party. They got it as wrong as anyone possibly could have. And it's a great impetus for a sensible, realist foreign policy of the kind that President Trump and J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, and other members of the administration have advocated, which is a great source of personal satisfaction to me.
Yes, in our foreign adventures, it seems that a good many Americans are simply culturally illiterate. They don't know enough about the place to which they're going, and presumably, maybe going to rule. One of my favorite sayings regarding the impact of cultural issues is from an Egyptian who said, "We don't have democracy here because we don't have any Democrats here. Small d Democrats." And what I would try to tell people, if I had a very short time to explain it to them, is that unless the culture of the country accepts the foundational principle of democratic constitutional rule, that all people are created equal, well, then there's not going to be any democratic constitutional rule there. As no one has pointed out as eloquently as you, David, this has been a very expensive bit of ignorance on the part of the United States, certainly in terms of a huge amount of treasure, but also in terms of lives. I've been meaning to ask you something to get us a little back to the subject of Ukraine and Russia, and that is Russia's war economy. Now, you have made the point that contrary to the expectation that there'd be an economic collapse in Russia because of this war, there hasn't been one. And in many ways, the Russian war economy is thriving, if I'm correctly paraphrasing you.
Russian industrial production has risen by 8% in the past 2 years. And Russia, at some point, well, according to an Estonian military estimate, Russia was producing last year 7 times as many artillery shells, howitzer shells, as all of NATO combined. For a country such as the United States, which was the arsenal of democracy and produced 200,000 planes and I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of tanks and swamped the Axis powers with our massive, apparently unlimited capacity to produce. This is really humiliating. And it should really be a wake-up call that we need to do something about our industrial base. Trump, of course, has put a lot of emphasis on this. I think it'll be a long, difficult road to get back. But if we learn any lesson from the war party's disaster, it's that we can't neglect our industrial base if we want to be a military power.
I think that question has arisen particularly in respect to China. If we don't want to be driven out of the Asia-Pacific area, we have to at least have some convincing military resources that could protect our interests.
China's a very difficult problem because just as a matter of arithmetic, a destroyer escort in a carrier group can carry in its hold about 100 interceptors. We can put, a couple dozen destroyers out there to escort carriers, but we know what the physical limits of what they can carry are going to be. The Chinese, as a land power with good interior communications, can have as many missiles as they want. They have many thousands of them. They can manufacture anti-ship cruise missiles as fast as they manufacture EVs. They've put videos on YouTube showing, automated factories that produce 1,000 cruise missile motors a day. They do not have limitations. It's an inherent imbalance between a land power and an expeditionary force, given the existing weaponry. If we just have basically explosives that you can deliver and go bang, the Chinese are going to win any engagement close to their borders. So we need different kinds of weapons that are smarter, different physical principles, perhaps directed energy weapons. I don't know what the right answer is. Back in the 1970s, when we were terrified about Russian surface-to-air missiles and Russian superiority in numbers, we tried all kinds of things, and we ended up inventing smart weapons that helped win the Cold War. We didn't know we were going to do that in 1975, but by 1982, we had revolutionized warfare. So we need to have the entrepreneurial spirit in our military budget as well to be inventive and innovative. Because if you just do a linear projection of where we are now, China has the advantage.
Well, President Trump has talked about some of these issues you just went over, but there's nothing reflected in the defense budget that shows a serious effort is going to be undertaken, at least not so far.
I saw a talk today by Alex Karp, who's the CEO of Palantir, the software company who does most of their work for the federal government, saying, well, why don't we do the software and the Japanese can provide the hardware? Now, I'm all for allying with Japan and South Korea and bringing them closer to us and collaborating on defense issues with them. But I'm also not comfortable with the idea that we would rely on our key military hardware for anyone but ourselves.
Yeah, I think you're right. As we're coming to a close here, David, I want to get back to Russia and the war economy. What's the Russian economy like without the war? Or what do you expect it to be like?
The Russian economy has always been something of a disaster with extremely good engineering and brilliant science and absolutely wretched industrial organization. The advantage of a war is it focuses industrial organization. I'm told that there are hundreds of Chinese engineers now working in Russian factories on industrial automation, and there are thousands of Russians studying in China. It's not simply that the Chinese have given the Russians a lot of things that they need for the war, like chips and components and so forth. I mean, their trade with Russia doubled during the Ukraine war directly, and there probably was much larger even than that because they shipped a lot of things through third parties, like the former Central Asian republics. The real risk is that Russia becomes really a satrapy of the Chinese economy in terms of industrial automation. And the Chinese, as we know, are doing more in industrial automation than anyone else. They install more industrial robots each year than the rest of the world combined, and they graduate more engineers each year than the rest of the world combined. So to the extent that the Russians piggyback on Chinese improvements in industrial productivity, automation, AI applications, and so forth, we may see a very different Russian economy than we're used to. The Russians are very talented people. They did, after all, get into space before we did. They nearly won the Cold War. They graduate in absolute numbers more engineers than we do, because a third of all Russian undergraduates study engineering. So even with a much smaller population, their highly skilled manpower compares very well with ours. So Russia could be a formidable contender as a military economic power, particularly in alliance with China. President Trump has said publicly that he doesn't want Russia and China to get too close together, and I certainly sympathize with that objective. But when you get down into the capillary level, what's happened in the Russian economy, it's very difficult to extract the Chinese component.
And I've heard that there is Chinese migration into southern Russia. They simply cross the border and live there and work there. I wonder to what extent Russians are concerned about being Sino-formed, the term that you have used in one of your books.
They're very concerned, and there's certainly a rivalry in Central Asia. Uh, but that there's also a certain element of cooperation. Central Asia is overwhelmingly Muslim, mainly Turkic peoples. It's the only large pool of young people with an education that's growing in size demographically in the world. There will be 100 million working age people in Central Asia by the end of this century, twice as many as the combined working age populations of Turkey and Iran. Most of the Turks in the world are going to be outside Anatolia. They'll be in Central Asia. So from Russia's standpoint, that could either lead to destabilization, Muslim radicalism, and so forth, or it could be an area for expansion. For it to expand economically, it needs infrastructure. The Chinese, with their Belt and Road Initiative, are the masters of building that kind of infrastructure. They've got the money and the resources to do it. So Russia and China, in a sense, are joined at the hip because of the need to provide connectivity in Central Asia. That's Russia's soft underbelly, and they don't want it to be poor, downtrodden, and destabilized. That would be a source of significant problems for them. Same with the Chinese. They locked down Xinjiang, to put the Uyghurs under very tough conditions in order to avoid political separatism in Xinjiang, but that's not that much different from the rest of Central Asia, the other Turkic peoples adjacent to Xinjiang. So Russia and China have common interests and are cooperating, even though they're still competing for influence in Central Asia. They kind of need each other. So separating Russia and China is quite a project, and there are many strong currents that you have to swim against to make that happen.
Well, it seems to me that we're coming rather late to the game. I mean, this is an issue that's been remarked upon for a long time, that the worst thing for the United States would be the reverse of what it had been in the latter part of the Cold War, where China was split from the Soviet Union, considerably weakening the Soviet position. And now everything we have been doing has had the opposite effect of bringing China and Russia closer together. I know President Trump's idea is to try to prevent that from growing even closer and maybe separating them. In a way, I have to think that's his principal motivation in preemptively conceding such major issues to Russia. I suppose these preemptive concessions are to demonstrate to Russia that we have a lot to offer, and we'll start giving it to you now without even asking for something in return.
Well, there are lots of things we can do, but they are almost the diametric opposite of what we've been doing for quite some time. So, for example, the Russians would love to import German cars as opposed to Chinese cars. Virtually every car you buy right now in Moscow is a Chinese car. They'd prefer to have the choice. They'd probably rather have German industrial technology than Chinese industrial technology. They'd probably like to have the German market for their natural gas as opposed to being dependent on the Chinese market or selling cut price oil to the Indians. So from the Russian standpoint, linking them to the West is most of all a matter of their economic relationship with Western Europe. But The Biden administration and the Obama administration spent years cultivating a European leadership that is so anti-Russian as to push the Russians in exactly the other direction. Friedrich Merz, the presumptive chancellor in the next government of Germany, is more anti-Russian than anyone in the United States. So that doesn't help us in terms of weaning Russia away from China. We have got a lot of untangling of year-old spaghetti in the back of the fridge to do in order to make that real. But Russia is Western culture. It's not Oriental culture. The Russians have much more in common with us than to do with China. Dostoevsky, is closer to Stendhal than he is to, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms.
And it's a great culture too. I mean, as I had the opportunity some years ago of having a lunch with the editor of Pravda, who is also a Central Committee member, and we spent the whole time talking about Russian culture and his evident pride in it for very good reason, and that, in my opinion, beginning in the late 19th century through the early part of the 20th, there took place in Russia a cultural renaissance of similar magnificence to the Renaissance in Italy or other renaissances in other parts of the West. And that's part of what many people in the West don't realize, is that cultural richness. Well, forgive that editorial comment, David.
No, I strongly share your views, Bob. Regarding Russia and China, I think the commonly made allegation that Putin is basically a revanchist like Hitler who wants to restore the Russian Empire, the borders of the Soviet Union, so he's going to march on Poland and the Baltic states and everyone else. I think that's nonsense. As I said before, with a rapidly declining adult population, Russia is in no position to do that. It's a very different kind of thing. Russia is interested in incorporating the 22 million Russians who are separated from Mother Russia in the near abroad. The thing they're most short of is Russians. And although there's very bad blood between Russia and Poland and the Baltic states and others since the Ukraine war, the wars are horrible. Nonetheless, Russia would rather be Western facing than Eastern facing. It's inherently in their culture and in their character and their interests. So we certainly have the ability to do it. It's simply that it would be, I think, utopian to expect them to break relations with China. Those relations got cemented in because of us and the Ukraine war, because of our sanctions, and the Russians won't give them up easily. They'll just want to be less dependent on the Chinese.
I think you're absolutely right. Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time, and I want to thank David Goldman, who is a fellow at the Corvinus Institute for Advanced Studies in Budapest, from where he has joined us for recording this program today to discuss, well, as it turned out, we discussed many things, but the idea that the Kickstarter for our discussion was his extremely insightful and provocative article on how the war party lost. So thank you, David, for joining us. And I'd like to encourage our audience to go to the Westminster Institute website, where you'll find, well, recordings of our other discussions with David Goldman, as well as with many other experts on subjects like the Russia-Ukraine war, but many on the subject of China, Japan, Taiwan, even on the causes of inflation, which is, by the way, another subject, David, we could cover with you. Well, thank you for joining us today. I'm Robert Riley.